Okay, so chapter 4 is about ecosystems and restoration ecology. So we've been building up. So chapter 52 was about populations. 53 was about communities with different populations living together, and this is about ecosystems, which is all the populations, all the communities, plus the abiotic factors. So an ecosystem consists of all the organisms living in a community as well as the abiotic factors in which they interact. So a single introduced species is also called an invasive species. Can have dramatic effects on both the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. So they can compete without natural predators. They can divide and multiply and compete for biotic resources as well as abiotic resources like nutrients from the soil or water and space. Ecosystems range from a microcosm, such as the space under a fallen log, to a large area such as a lake or island. Regardless of an ecosystem's size, its dynamics involve two main processes that we'll look at: energy flow and chemical cycling. And those are the two main parts of this chapter: the flow of energy through an ecosystem and chemical cycling. So energy flows through ecosystems. So the energy flows through while matter cycles within ecosystems, so within the organisms and so on. So let's look at some background here. Physical laws govern energy flow and chemical cycling. So the energy flow and chemical cycling are the two major parts here that we're talking about. So ecologists study the transformations of energy and matter within ecosystems. So we talked a little bit about energy transformations way back in chapter 6, all right, with the laws of thermodynamics and so on. So the conservation of energy. Laws of physics and chemistry apply to ecosystems, particularly energy flow. So the first law of thermodynamics states that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. So we talked about that before. And energy enters an ecosystem as solar radiation, is conserved, and is lost from organisms as heat. So we talked about that when we talked about cellular respiration. The second law of thermodynamics states that every exchange of energy increases the entropy. Do you guys remember what entropy was? Remember, that's the disorder of the universe. So in an ecosystem, energy conversions are not completely efficient, and some energy is always lost as heat. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the conservation of mass. The law of conservation of mass states that matter can be neither created nor destroyed. So this was energy can be neither created nor destroyed, neither can matter. So chemical elements are continually recycled within ecosystems. In a forest ecosystem, most nutrients enter as dust or solutes in rain and are carried away in water as well, like the groundwater or water that doesn't get absorbed into the ground, and it's kind of like runs off into lower areas. So ecosystems are what we call open systems. They absorb energy and mass and release heat and waste products. All right, so those are the two overarching kind of ideas with this when we're looking at ecosystems. So let's look at the next page. So it says blank build molecules themselves using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis as an energy source, and those are called autotrophs. Auto means self, so they're like self-feeding. They make their own food through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, like the organisms on the bottom of an ocean where there's no light that gets there, no photosynthesis can occur, but you have an ecosystem down there, so you have to have organisms that start the food chain, and those organisms can use sulfur gases that are released from hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, and can use those to make their own food and therefore be the producers, and then something can eat them and so on, and you get a food chain. So then we are in this next category, heterotrophs. depend on the biosynthetic output of other organisms. So what does that mean? We use other organisms for food. So we have to eat. Any heterotroph has to eat something. They cannot make their own food. Energy and nutrients pass from what we call primary consumers. Primary producers. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Which are also called your autotrophs, to, and then see if you can fill in the rest of these blanks. To, this is where primary consumers come into play. And then primary consumers, the energy is passed to the secondary consumers. To, and then that would be the tertiary consumers. Do you remember what comes after tertiary? Quaternary. All right. So notice here it says it's herbivores. It doesn't necessarily always have to be herbivores. Because we can act as a primary consumer, right? Yeah. When we eat our vegetables, we are acting as a primary consumer. So it doesn't always have to be an herbivore, meaning that it only eats plant material. An important part of the ecosystem are what we call the detritivores. These are the decomposers that derive their energy from detritus, which is non-living organic matter. So this is like dead organisms or waste products from organisms, like solid waste, like number 2. All right, and what are examples of them? Prokaryotic cells, so bacteria are important decomposers, and so are fungi. And so what happens is decomposition actually connects all trophic levels. So let's look at how that happens. So I'm gonna get a couple of highlighters again and kind of show you this. So let's do this. This is showing you cycling. So here is the sun, then primary producers, primary consumers, secondary and tertiary consumers. And so it shows the flow of both chemicals as well as energy. And so let's use pink for the chemical cycling. And so I'll just go ahead and draw. So I'll notice here, this side of the arrow is darker than this side of the arrow, so I'm only going to do the one side of the arrow here and the one side of the arrow here, all right, to show this. And so then this is pink, all right, and this whole part here is pink, or whatever color you're using. So I just want to highlight this whole part here. This is all pertaining to chemical cycling in this part here. And then again, the darker portions, so this side and this side. Okay, this side. And I'll explain all this in just a second. I just think it's helpful to be able to see that. Okay, oh, and I forgot this one. Okay, and then we'll do energy flow. I'm going to use a yellow highlighter for energy flow. So energy flow, so I'm going to talk about energy flow as I do it. So energy ultimately for an ecosystem comes from the sun. So I'm going to color this arrow, and the primary producers absorb that energy. Then that energy, some of that is used by the producers, some of it stays in the body of the producers, the energy, and some of it is lost as heat. So I'm going to do the heat loss here as energy flow. So then the energy that's stored in the primary producers are passed on to the primary consumers. So these guys eat here, so that energy, now that primary consumer uses some of that energy, and some that is released as heat again, and then some of that energy stays within the body, and if it's eaten by secondary consumers, that energy gets passed on to the secondary and tertiary consumers. They use up some of that energy, and the energy is eventually converted to heat. So this part is the flow of energy when these organisms are alive. This part is when they die. So when all these guys die, any energy that's stored in them, in the molecules in their body, gets passed on to, or is in the dead part of the organism. So that's called detritus. So this is all the dead matter. We just wrote that up here. All right. Detritus, non-living organic matter. So now that energy is in this dead organic matter, and what eats them is microorganisms. So the energy in here, all right, goes to the microorganisms. But then we have the flow back here, because when these guys die themselves, they become detritus as well and can be consumed. All right, and some of these guys can eat these guys, and so some of the energy can flow to them. All right, and as these guys use the energy, it gets converted to heat, and so you get some energy loss there. And so that's the flow of energy. Now, I just went through and highlighted the chemical, so I want to talk a minute about that. I'm going to get a pink pen to kind of, well, actually, I'll better write it in black so we can see it better. I just want to talk about the flow of chemical cycling. So let's talk about the flow of carbon. So carbon enters primary producers as CO2, right, for photosynthesis. So these guys are going to do photosynthesis. They're going to take CO2 from the atmosphere, and so that's the carbon going in, and they're going to use that CO2 to make what molecule in photosynthesis? All right, glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6, so it made some glucose, and then it shows you here that the chemical cycling, the pink arrow, so now we're following the pink arrows, are going to go here. So therefore, whatever carbon is stored in these in the molecules of these primary producers, the primary consumers are going to eat them. So now you have some carbon like glucose and other carbon compounds here. And then why does this one make glucose, and why do we eat glucose as a primary consumer? It's to break it down for cellular respiration and therefore release CO2. So that's why these CO2 arrows are coming out here, is as these guys use up some of that glucose it makes. Remember, it uses some of it for energy, and that releases CO2. It stores some of it. That stored glucose can be now passed on to the primary consumers. They're going to store some of that glucose and release some as CO2. So that's what we have here, an arrow coming out here. Then when these guys are eaten by these guys, some of that stored glucose is going to be passed here, glucose and carbon compounds as well, and they're going to use some of it and therefore release CO2 and store some of it. So then all the stored glucose in these dead organic molecules are now in the detritus. So now there's carbon compounds. It could be some of glucose, some other carbon compounds as well, and in the dead organic matter. And so then what's going to happen is those carbon compounds are going to go to the microorganisms, and so that's why you have the flow this way here. So they're going to, that carbon is eaten by this guy here. That's going to be there. And then when these guys die, the carbon compounds become detritus. When these guys are eaten here, the carbon compounds in these guys here get converted here. All right. And so that's your chemical cycling. And so, and these guys here, the CO2 eventually gets put back into the atmosphere. And so that is chemical cycling in terms of the carbon. And so as an example. So let's look at energy and other limiting factors control primary production in ecosystems. In most ecosystems, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs. All right, so primary production is basically, it's talking about photosynthesis here, light energy converted to chemical energy. The sunlight making glucose. In a few ecosystems, there are those chemoautotrophs that I just talked about in the bottom of the ocean that are the primary producers. But most often, the primary production is this part here where they're actually using light energy. So ecosystem energy budgets, the extent of photosynthetic production sets the spending limit for an ecosystem's energy budget, because if how many producers you have capturing energy from the sunlight and making glucose, you have a set amount of energy then in these primary producers, so that sets the rest of the ecosystem, because you can't have more organisms that you have energy to support. So the more photosynthetic organisms you have, the more other organisms you can support, because that producer base is large and therefore producing converting lots of energy. All right, so let's turn over here to global energy budgets. So the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's surface limits photosynthetic output. So going back here, so the amount of sunlight that can be captured is going to limit how much photosynthesis and therefore how much glucose and therefore how much energy is in the ecosystem. Actually, only a small fraction of solar energy actually strikes photosynthetic organisms, and even less is of usable wavelength. So remember that the photosystems and the chloroplasts absorb certain wavelengths of light. So chlorophyll A absorbs, the different types of chlorophyll A absorb certain wavelengths of light. So therefore it's a small fraction. So let's look at the difference between gross and net production. So total primary production is known as the ecosystem's gross primary productivity. Or GPP for short, for GPP. So let's look at GPP is measured as the conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time. So chemical energy, the conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time, like a year, let's say. Now, that's different than net primary productivity. Is the gross primary productivity, GPP, minus energy used by primary producers for when we use, so you're making glucose here for the gross primary productivity. Why do you make glucose? You use it for cellular respiration. And this NPP, the net primary productivity, is expressed as energy per unit area per time. So energy is measured in joules. So energy is measured in joules per unit area. So that's meters, in this case here, meters squared. So joules per meter squared per unit time. So in this is here per year. All right, or you can measure it in biomass. So biomass added per unit time. So biomass is measured in grams, per unit area is meters squared, per unit time is year. All right, and so you can measure this in either way. So let's go through and talk about, let me just talk a little bit about this and make it hopefully a little bit easier to understand. So if you've had a job, you may have noticed that you get a gross pay and a net pay. Gross is actually how much you made. So you make so many dollars an hour, and then you work so many hours, you multiply that, and that's your gross pay. But that's not what you take home. Your take-home pay is your net pay. And your net pay, what does that do? It takes out taxes and everything. It takes out all these other things. And so then you get what you actually take home. So let me relate that to plants. All right, so your GPP, your gross primary productivity, that's how much photosynthesis is going on, how much glucose is actually made. So that's how much glucose is actually made. But when you eat a plant that has done photosynthesis, you don't get all the glucose that was made by that plant. Why? Because that plant uses some of that glucose to live itself. So it's going to use it for cellular respiration and release the heat and so on. And so therefore, we have to subtract that. And so that process in which the plant uses glucose for its own purposes is called respiration. So we have to minus respiration or cellular respiration. And so then what we end up getting, our leftover, is that's the net primary productivity. So let's write in terms underneath it in terms of what's going on with glucose. So in photosynthesis, this is all the glucose produced. Minus the glucose used by the plant. I guess I could write all produced by plant. And what this is this is the glucose left in the plant for you and I to eat, or an herbivore. And I'll put here that it's stored. So really the plant, when it makes glucose, it adds mass to the plant, but then it uses some of that glucose and it releases it as heat, and some of that for cellular respiration, you get rid of some of that carbon through breathing out, releasing CO2, and so on. So what you have left over, the glucose left in the plant, this glucose left in the plant increases the biomass of the plant. Bio mean living, mass, so that's in grams, all right, because it's storing this glucose in there. So you're increasing the biomass. And it's when something comes to eat the plant, this is the mass that it's eating and getting energy from. So NPP is the amount of new biomass added in a given time period. So that could be per year or so on. And we can measure this biomass by actually measuring the grams. We can also look at energy like we just talked about up here. All right. So only MPP is available to consumers. So when we eat the plant, this is what we're getting. So if we look at different types of ecosystems, tropical rainforests, estuaries are when fresh water meet salt water, and so that could be where a river meets the ocean. Coral reefs, all of those different types of ecosystems are among the most productive ecosystems per unit area. So again, if you're looking at a meter squared, most productive now, meaning that it's NPP, all right, it's doing a lot of photosynthesis, and therefore there's the base of the food chain is great. And so marine ecosystems, that means saltwater, so this is the ocean. Marine ecosystems are relatively unproductive per unit area, but contribute much to global net primary production because of their sheer size. So if you look at, a certain area of the ocean, it may not be that productive and do that much photosynthesis and therefore release, oxygen and so on. But the fact that it covers so much of the earth and there's just so much of it that even though per unit area it's not that productive, it still provides a good amount of primary productivity for its sheer size. All right, so therefore net ecosystem production is a measure of the total biomass accumulation during a given time. So how much biomass is accumulating in a given time period. And therefore, that tells us and gives us an idea of how productive the ecosystem is or how much biomass is added. And the biomass, remember, is as a result of how much photosynthesis after you've taken away respiration. So NEP is gross primary production minus the total respiration of all the organisms in an ecosystem. So that's what we just did up here. NEP is estimated by comparing the influx of CO2 and O2 in an ecosystem, which are two molecules connected by photosynthesis. Remember, in photosynthesis, this carbon dioxide is taken in, and O2 is released. So the release of O2 by a system is an indication that it's also storing CO2. All right, because when it releases O2, you can measure the O2 released. You know that photosynthesis is taking place, which means CO2 had to go in for it to make glucose, and therefore you have a higher NPP. And when it stores CO2, we're really storing it as glucose, because when they take in CO2 for photosynthesis, it's using it to make glucose. So let's look at production in aquatic ecosystems, and then we'll look at terrestrial ecosystems. So in aquatic ecosystems, in both marine and freshwater ecosystems, both light and nutrients control primary production. So let's talk about light. Light limitation. The depth of light penetration affects primary production in the photic zone of an ocean or lake. So how, what happens is if you have a lake, the sun is shining, the deeper you go, there's less light that reaches there, and eventually no light will be able to reach. And so that's obviously going to affect the production, because production is, dealing with photosynthesis, and if you don't have light, you can't do photosynthesis. Let's look at nutrient limitation. More than light, nutrients actually limit primary production in most oceans and lakes. So what we call a limiting nutrient is the element that must be added for production to increase in an area. So what do you have to add? And then the plants can do more photosynthesis, and so you have increased production. So the two main nutrients, limiting nutrients, are nitrogen and phosphorus. Are the nutrients that most often limit marine production, meaning that if you don't have it, then you're not going to do production, but if you add it, you must be added to for production to increase. And so nutrient enrichment experiments confirmed that nitrogen was the limiting phytoplankton growth. So these are free-floating photosynthetic organisms. So it was limiting phytoplankton growth off the shore of Long Island, New York. So let's do some color coding here on this graph. So ammonium, I'm going to do as orange. Ammonium is a source of nitrogen. And so that is the larger bars in each one of these. All right, and then phosphate, we'll do in green. So that's a source of phosphorus. And so that is right next to it to the right here. So green, 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 green. The middle one. And that means, I won't color code the other one. The gray one just means the unenriched, meaning it wasn't added to the soil. So let's look at here. These are different collection sites off the shore of Long Island, New York. So the unenriched control is that they collected the water and figured out the phytoplankton density, millions of cells per milliliter of water. All right, so you can see here that it wasn't very high originally. So that's kind of like your control. All right, so the unenriched control. And then what they did is then at the different sites, they added phosphorus. And so then you can see this is the growth with the phosphorus added at the different sites. But then look at when they added nitrogen, boom, they started growing and got way more phytoplankton. What that tells them is that the nitrogen was the limiting factor here. It was the limiting nutrient, the element that must be added for production to increase in the area. Well, if you have more phytoplankton, have you increased production and photosynthesis? Absolutely. And so therefore, nitrogen was the limiting nutrient. You added it, you see a greater increase in phytoplankton. So an upwelling of nutrient-rich water in parts of the ocean contribute to regions of high primary production. So if you get just parts in the ocean where the nutrient-rich, the nutrients come up from the bottom, where like decaying organisms are broken down, you can have areas that have high primary production there. And it doesn't have to be the whole ocean as a whole, because the ocean's so big. So the addition of large amounts of nutrients to lakes has had a wide range of ecological impacts. In some areas, sewage runoff has caused eutrophication, which is what we looked at in our packet, of lakes, which can lead to a loss of most species. In lakes, phosphorus limits cyanobacterial growth. This is bacteria that does photosynthesis. And so what has happened is that the phosphorus sewage runoff, I'm going to write here, contains nitrogen and phosphorus. And what it does is, if this is the lake here, and this is the bottom of the lake, and you have an added, if you put nitrogen and phosphorus, what happens is, and you have fish swimming around here, and so and this is the sunlight shining, and you have seaweed, all right, plants growing, and you have sunlight shining, and you might have some algae, but just a little bit of algae here growing. And so what happens is, when you have increased nutrients, the plants start growing like crazy. So because of this, so increase, let's do them pink. The increase in this causes the growth of more plants, because the plants are just happy as larks taking in these nutrients. They need nitrogen and phosphorus to make proteins and other organic molecules, and so they start growing like crazy. The algae start growing like crazy, and then what happens is then it starts blocking the sunlight. So then guess what happens? Your seaweed die, all right, so the seaweed die, and now you have more detritus on the bottom, and then what likes that is then the fungus starts eating the detritus, or the bacteria, the decomposers, and they start dividing like crazy, and what happens is any O2 that's in the water that the fish and everybody was using, the fungus and the bacteria start using up, and then that decreases the concentration of oxygen inside the lake, and the fish, these guys die. All right, which then they go to the bottom of the lake, and the decomposers feed off of them and start reproducing and replicating, and then they deplete even more oxygen, and so therefore the oxygen content has gone down. That's the process of eutrophication. So this has led to the use of phosphate-free detergents. So sometimes if you look in the aisle where you buy detergents, they sell phosphate-free detergents, so we don't put more phosphorus in our rivers and therefore lakes and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is eutrophication. So that is with aquatic ecosystems. Let's look at terrestrial ecosystems next. All right, so primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. In terrestrial ecosystems, it's temperature and moisture. So how warm it is and how rainy or how much precipitation there is affects the primary production. So in remember in aquatic ecosystems, it was nutrients and light. Okay? So primary production increases with moisture, which is what we see here with this graph here. So the annual precipitation, if the mean annual precipitation average goes up, we have net annual primary production, so per year, goes up as well. So we talked before about evapotranspiration. So evaporation from the soil as well as transpiration given off by the leaves of plants is it's the water transpired by plants and evaporated from the landscape that helps and affects the moisture content. And so this is also affected, though, by precipitation, temperature, and solar energy. And so you can have more or less evapotranspiration depending upon these three things. And so this is related to the net primary production. So the more moisture, in warmer temperatures. So moisture and warmer temperatures increase primary production. All right, and so let's talk about nutrient limitations in the terrestrial ecosystems. On a more large scale, a soil nutrient is often the limiting factor in primary production. So instead of the nutrients being floating in the water, it's actually in the soil for terrestrial plants. In terrestrial ecosystems, nitrogen is the most common limiting nutrient. And so phosphorus can also be a limiting nutrient, but it's more often nitrogen. And this is why we put nitrogen and phosphorus both in our fertilizers that we put on gardens and lawns and things like that to help the plants to grow. Various adaptations help plants access limiting nutrients from the soil. So some plants form mutualisms where they both benefit with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into a usable form for plants. All right, so that's what they do. Let's write that here. And convert it. So they take nitrogen from air and convert it to a form plants can use. Many plants form mutualisms, again, both benefiting with a certain kind of fungi. These fungi supply plants with phosphorus and other limiting nutrients. The plants also have root hairs that increase their surface area. So here's the ground, here's the plant, here's the roots. They have little hairs that increase the surface area. And many plants release enzymes that increase the availability of limiting nutrients, where they can break down things in the soil and therefore expose and get limiting nutrients as well. So those are some of the adaptations in order to get those limiting nutrients so that they can grow and do the most photosynthesis possible. All right, and this is why we have nitrogen and phosphorus in our fertilizers, which is often then causes back over here that eutrophication process, because when we put nitrogen and phosphorus on our lawn, let's say, and it rains, that nitrogen and phosphorus can get into the groundwater, which then leads to the lake, which puts excess nutrients here and then causes the whole blocking of the sunlight, the algae to grow, block the sunlight, and everything dies. The fungus and bacteria use up all the oxygen and eutrophication happens. So we actually can cause lakes and ponds and things like that to undergo the process of eutrophication by our actions. So we talked a little bit yesterday about food chains and food webs and how the energy transfer, only about 10% is transferred from one trophic level to the next. So that's what we're going to look at next. So far what we've talked about is we just looked at primary production. So this is secondary production. Secondary production of an ecosystem is the amount of chemical energy in food converted to new biomass during a given period of time. So in a year or whatever it may be. So converted to new biomass. Let's look back at where we talked about primary production. Back here, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy. So light to chemical energy is photosynthesis. Now we're looking at amount of chemical energy in food converted to biomass. So the amount of chemical energy you eat in food, some of that goes to be converted and make new biomass for you to grow. Some of it's used, and some of that energy is released, and that mass is released when you breathe out CO2. The carbon and the oxygen of CO2 have a mass. And so not all the food energy that you, or food biomass that you eat becomes part of you. So production efficiency. When a caterpillar feeds on a leaf, only about 1/6 of the leaf's energy is used for secondary production. And we can think of secondary production as growth. An organism's production efficiency is the fraction of energy stored in food that's not used for respiration. So it's not used for respiration. So what is it used for? It's used for new biomass. So let's look at this picture down here. Before we write down, it says write equation here. We're going to look here. This picture here where the plant, here's the caterpillar eating the plant. The leaf has 200 joules. So this is the measurement of how much energy it is. So when the caterpillar takes in 200 joules. So a lot of that energy is going to be released as feces. So it's not assimilated or isn't taken in by the caterpillar. So it's going to go right through the caterpillar and be released as solid waste, because your waste has energy in it as well. And therefore, along with it is the biomass, all right, that's in that waste. Then we look here, 33 joules of that 200 stays in the caterpillar and becomes new biomass. So that's with growth. That's the new biomass. That's secondary production that we just wrote about. And then some of that 200 is going to be used for cellular respiration. So you're going to take some of that glucose, break it down. Some of that's going to be, the mass is going to release the CO2 and water back into the atmosphere. And so some of that 67 joules out of that 200 is going to be used for cellular respiration, and it can be released as heat and so on. This is called assimilated. The energy for cellular respiration is still considered to be assimilated because it doesn't pass through. It's going to be in there for a while, although most of that energy is eventually going to be released as heat eventually. So really the only energy that's available to the organism that's going to eat the caterpillar is this 33 joules. All right, so let's look here, then let's write the equation. So what we do to figure out the production efficiency, we take the net secondary production divided by assimilation of primary production and multiply by 100 to get a percentage. And so if we look here, how that works with this is the net secondary production here is when the leaf is eaten by the caterpillar, only 33 joules, that's a secondary production, the net secondary production is actually used for biomass. So net meaning that we're going to take everything that's assimilated, so you have anything that's not excreted. So you have these guys here, both assimilated, but we're going to subtract cellular respiration, so the part that's actually left in the caterpillar is the 33 joules. So 33 joules divided by assimilation of primary production. So what's the primary production? That's the amount of energy that was stored in the leaf to be used by the caterpillar, and that was 200 joules. So the caterpillar ate a total of 200 joules. That's the amount of energy that was there, and only 33 joules of that is going to be used to be in new biomass. And so therefore we can take that and multiply it by 100, and what do we get? And you should have gotten, when you do this, 16.5, and that's a percent. So it's 16.5 efficient. That's the production efficiency. So out of all the energy stored in the plant that was assimilated or taken in by the caterpillar, 33 out of the 200, or 16.5% of it, was used to actually generate biomass. All right, and so that is production efficiency. So let's look at particular organisms. Birds and mammals have efficiencies in the range of 1 to 3% because of the high cost of endothermy. Endothermic animals, we regulate our body temperature. And so we expend energy to do that. And so therefore we're not as productive or efficient. Fishes have production efficiencies around 10%, and insects can have, or microorganisms have efficiencies of 40% or more. All right, so we are very low in terms of production efficiency compared to other organisms. So when we look at trophic levels and trophic efficiency, we can relate this in these what I call ecological pyramids. So trophic efficiency is the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next. I don't know, that's supposed to be up here. All right, so how much is transferred from one trophic level to the other? So from the producers to the primary consumers and so on. And remember, it is usually about 10% with a range. That's an average. So this is an average. So it can be anywhere from 5 to 20%. So some organisms are higher. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. So it says trophic efficiency is multiplied over the length of a food chain. So for instance, if we look at and we do a food chain, so the bottom of the food chain is your primary producer, and then you have your primary consumer, then you have your secondary consumer, and you have your tertiary consumer. So then let's say that there are 100 joules of energy here. All right, that means if only 10% is transferred, you're going to get 10. 10% transferred, 1. 10% transferred, what are you going to get here? 0.1. And so it goes down by 10%, or only 10% is transferred. That means it's losing 90%. So 90% is given off as heat and used by the organism themselves to actually live. All right, so that's going to help to explain the next bullet. It says approximately blank of chemical energy fixed by photosynthesis reaches a tertiary consumer, and that is 0.1. If this is like 100%, 10%, 1%, and so 0.1% of all the energy that was in the primary producer actually reaches through that food chain the tertiary consumer. So 0.1%. All right, and so we can look at a pyramid of net production. It represents the loss of energy with each transfer in the food chain. So this is looking at, this is what's called a production pyramid. And so you can see here, 10,000 in light, a million joules in light. The sunlight is not part of the pyramid because it's not a living organism. So then, let's say the primary producers absorb only 10,000 of that million joules of light, and then 1,000, then 10% from that, 10% transfers 100, then 10. All right. In a biomass pyramid, each tier represents the dry mass of all the organisms in one trophic level. So dry mass means if you dry it out, what's the mass, not including the water. Most biomass pyramids show a sharp decrease at successively higher trophic levels. So for instance here, so this is a biomass pyramid. And so this biomass pyramid, you have a greater mass, 809 grams, and then lesser and lesser and lesser as you go up the trophic levels here. And so most ecosystems, that's the case where the producers have the greatest biomass. And very few, some aquatic ecosystems, have the primary producers much lower. Let me explain why. These guys reproduce fast, but you don't get them, you don't get a big bottom of the pyramid there because they're eaten so fast. So they reproduce fast, but are eaten fast. So they don't accumulate. And that's why you don't get the big base. Okay? So certain aquatic ecosystems have inverted biomasses. That's what I just talked about here. The inverted biomass. Producers, which are often the phytoplankton, are consumed so quickly they are outweighed by primary consumers, so they have more mass there. So energy flow and nutrient cycling then are key processes in ecosystems such as the Arctic tundra. All right, and this is where we're going to stop here, and the next video we'll look at section 4.